This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 127. I'm your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Just before I sat down to record, I was thinking about how it's been a while since I gave any sort of introduction to listeners that may be relatively new to the show. And so without further ado, my name's Joe, and I'm a senior analyst here at Blackstone. That means I'm one of the folks on staff that looks at the data we obtain from the samples you send in and explain what we found, as well as what it means to you and whatever it is you're sampling. We find a personalized approach isn't just what sets us apart in the world of oil analysis. It's just plain helpful to you, the owner, to have a comment that's written with you and your sample in mind. We take into account trends and changes from the norm for your engine specifically. So, there you have it. Real people are involved every step of the way, from the unpacking of your sample to the testing itself, and finally, the report that you receive. Sure, it might be easier to spit out an AI-generated comment, but that's not what's going to help you make the most informed decisions about your maintenance plan. But more recently, AI and language-based models such as ChatGPT, they're frequently used for just about anything these days, often as a tool for information retrieval or problem solving in general. So here's how people typically use them. They'll ask the AI model a question and it spits out a response. We've even had some folks find out about oil analysis through the use of AI models. So for today's episode, I figured why not see what sort of tips AI might give for the frequently asked questions we receive on a daily basis here at Blackstone Laboratories, and then sort out what might be useful and what might be missing from AI recommendations. First off, I entered the question, how often should I change the engine oil? For this particular response, the AI program spit out a few interesting things. First of all, they have a guideline for conventional oil, stating that typically every 3,000 to 5,000 miles is a good time to change it. So right there, veteran listeners of the program, folks who have been sampling with us for a while, probably know what my response is going to be, but nevertheless, here it is. We find that conventional oil can often outperform people's expectations. So even if it's not synthetic, you don't want to rule out a longer run, even than what might be recommended on the bottle, just because it's conventional. That's right. Even though it's not the expensive stuff, your engine can still use it for an interval that may even be longer than what you think it can. But you want to look at the data to see how long that oil should be in use. And that goes for conventional or synthetic. Because next up, the AI program recommended that synthetic oils could stay in use 7,500 to 10,000 miles. And what's more, some high-quality synthetics could reportedly go up to 15,000 miles. Well, not to be too haughty, but I have news for AI on this front. Even the most expensive oil can't fend off contaminants, it won't maintain active additives, or prevent metal from accumulating when there is a problem. So whether you're running conventional or whether you're running synthetic, the AI program can't rule out any pre-existing issues. Next up, we have a guideline relating to driving conditions. Specifically, the AI program stating that if you often drive in severe conditions, such as stop-and-go traffic, extreme temperatures, towing, or short trips, you might need to change your oil more frequently. So this recommendation is not unique in any way, shape, or form when it comes to the vast majority of vehicle maintenance tips and tricks that you've probably heard already. With that being said, as I've established already when it comes to oil change intervals in terms of length, you don't merely want to think about whether or not you're running synthetic or conventional, but what's going on in the engine that's using those oils. And the same goes for driving conditions, in that some engines can handle harder use better than others. even going back to episode 126 that we just did about motorcycles and outperforming the norms when it comes to harder use, we find that people can often go longer than they think, even when it comes to engines being used for racing exclusively. So as with the differences between synthetic or conventional, keep in mind that driving conditions and what constitutes harder use, that really depends on the engine and the owner that is taking care of it. One owner's version of harder use is going to be different than another's. And while a safe approach of shorter oil runs is never a bad thing, don't assume that just because, say, you do a lot of stop and go driving, or if you're mostly on the highway, that it means you have a definite ceiling on your oil change interval. Often people will write in on their slips that, oh, this car is seeing, 80% highway use. And generally, they think that's going to be more demanding, when in fact, it's kind of the opposite. So go to the numbers first instead of assuming harder use or conventional products or synthetics necessitate a particular oil change interval. Next up, we have a recommendation that I certainly wouldn't disagree with, especially when you're starting an oil analysis file, and that is following manufacturer recommendations. The AI program offered that you should always check your owner's manual for the specific oil change interval recommended by the vehicle manufacturer. And look, that's always going to be a safe bet, especially when you're in the warranty stage. You don't want to nullify your warranty. And also, when you're starting your file, a manufacturer recommended interval is a great baseline because your engine should be able to handle that. And you're not going to be doing anything excessive or outside what that engine should be capable of by following that manufacturer recommended interval. Then as you build trends, we'll learn what your engine can do, and a shorter interval may be needed, or you could end up running longer. But I will agree that a manufacturer recommended interval is a great starting place, especially if you are new to oil analysis and are wondering how to get the ball rolling. And lastly, in response to the question, how often should I change the oil? We have oil life monitoring systems, and that some modern vehicles come with those, and they will calculate when an oil change is necessary based on driving habits. Previous episodes of this show have focused on oil life monitoring systems in particular. One is called Down Goes the OLM. Feel free to check that out if you want an in-depth breakdown on how we view OLMs and what those percentages can translate to in terms of how we see the oil holding up. But in general, I will say that oil life monitoring systems tend to be pretty conservative, and that's not a bad thing. You're never going to run the oil too long by following the OLM, or at least I haven't stumbled across situations where the OLM was, say, 5%. And then on our end, we're seeing a ton of metal and contamination and other findings that indicate the oil should not have been run that long. If anything, I might have seen one situation recently where the OLM and our report matched up pretty closely. Specifically in terms of the TBN, which tells you how much active additive is remaining. The customer's OLM was getting pretty low. It was in the single digits, and the TBN on our end was pretty low. So in that particular instance, we met pretty closely. So OLMs are much like a manufacturer interval. They are a safe bet. However, they do not take into account the vast majority of things that our report does. It's mainly a baseline. And the last little tidbit the AI program offered here in regards to oil change recommendations, this one did get an honest chuckle out of me when I first saw it, and that is keeping an eye on your oil level and condition. If the oil looks dirty or you notice unusual performance, it might be a good idea to change it. All I'll say on this briefly is that looks can be deceiving, and you never want to merely rely on appearance to dump what could very well be perfectly fine oil. Keep in mind, oil will darken just from mixing with the previous fill that was in there. You never get all of it out. About 20% tends to linger, sometimes more. There are some engines where you'll even have 40% or more hang around. It just can depend on the model. But in general, you're going to have some that will darken the color of the new oil you put in. And also, some people view a darkened color the wrong way. If anything, it often means the oil's doing its job. not that it is breaking down prematurely. You want to look at things like viscosity and insolubles to see if that oil is breaking down, and both of those things are included in our standard analysis. The next question I decided to ask this AI program was very broad stroke, even more so perhaps than how often should I change the oil, and that is, does my engine have a problem? And this was kind of amusing to me just because of how on our end, we're here to help you catch a problem early. So I just feel bad for folks who have to wait until things are so noticeably bad on their end that they know they have one. Because if you know about oil analysis and you put it to good use, you should be able to catch issues before these symptoms crop up. Specifically, the AI program wanted to stress things like poor fuel economy, strange smells, which, you can have those alert you to a potential issue. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but for every example of a customer reporting that the oil smells like fuel, it's actually fairly rare for that to coincide, at least in my experience, with samples that are indeed chock full of fuel. But nevertheless, you can have that happen. They also talked about things like diminished responsiveness, which again, it is a thing that can go along with a problem. It's just that if you take oil analysis and what it can do in identifying concerning changes in how your motor or your transmission is wearing, of course, diminished responsiveness can go along with an issue. It's just that ideally, you catch it earlier, but of course, if you do start having a noticeable issue in operation, whether that be things like low oil pressure knocking sounds, then you likely do need to take next steps. However, this last one about a sweet smell, the AI program specifically noted that as a way to detect a coolant leak. Let me encourage you instead to go to the numbers that will speak to whether or not coolant is present at microscopic levels. The sniff test is not something that I would consider particularly reliable in this case. Look at the elements, specifically potassium and sodium, and conveniently, that is where I wanted to go last with this AI program, is I wanted to ask them about a more specific problem, see if I could dial this in a bit more. And in this case, I asked, how do I know if I have a coolant leak? So per the AI program, here are the methods to check for a coolant leak. A visual inspection of the hoses, radiator connections for cracks, corrosion, or wet spots, a pressure test, UV dye test, checking the oil specifically for a milky or frothy appearance on the dipstick. However, I am disappointed to find that oil analysis was nowhere in the AI recommendations. We must have missed the cut somewhere. What can I say? Maybe we'll get there in the future. But don't mistake my response for being disappointed that Blackstone Laboratories wasn't named here, but rather, I guess my frustration stems from the fact that by the time you're seeing noticeable coolant loss or a frothy milkshake type appearance on the dipstick itself, often that's to the point where coolant is not only reaching the engine oil, but causing a lot of damage in the process, specifically in the form of poor wear, and that is often related to the oil breaking down physically. When coolant mixes with the oil, it takes its ability to clean and lubricate properly, and it also causes it to oxidize rapidly. All of that mixing together in a cocktail that's going to result in something far worse than a hangover. It's going to result in the engine wearing heavily, often to the point of failure if it really goes unchecked. So oil analysis isn't merely something that should be included here, but also it will help you avoid significant damage by finding a leak early. Now, of course, if you do have noticeable coolant loss, it's not always going to be an internal situation. So taking some of these measures like a pressure test, a UV dye test, they're certainly not a bad idea. But if you've been checking your engine oil and you've been developing trends, then you already know how the coolant markers are tracking and whether or not they indicate a leak. We catch problems on a microscopic level, so often that alerts folks to issues before they're even noticing coolant loss on their end, and by virtue of that, the engine is also usually not wearing heavily when you catch one in the very early stages. Maybe AI will catch on. We'll see. But for now, this was a fun exercise to see where the overlap is and where we differ. I think that in general, what I've learned from this exercise is that AI can gear you towards some broad stroke recommendations that tend to be in the ballpark of what's a good idea, right? Following the OLM is a good idea starting out. Following your manufacturer recommended interval is, again, a safe place to start, especially when you're trying to find, what oil change interval should I begin sampling with Blackstone and where do I go from there? But keep in mind that a broad stroke approach, one that doesn't take into account you, your engine, and what it's doing, often won't get the most out of the money you're spending on not only the motor, but the oil itself. Developing an oil analysis program for what it is you're taking care of will help you save money either by allowing you to run that oil longer or catching problems before they manifest in the obvious symptoms that often go along with the engine being in serious trouble from a wear standpoint. So instead of merely taking an artificial approach, why not go for the real deal, specifically the data from your motor, using that to get the most out of the engine and the oil you're running. You can do all that with Blackstone Laboratories. That brings today's show to a close. Thank you all for tuning in. And if you liked what you heard today, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.